Undeniably, the world remains plagued by crisis and a host of enduring injustices owed to colonial power and domination.
In turn, countless revolutionary thinkers from times past and present have identified modernity as a point source of oppression.
When taking stock of the violent ways in which modernity was and continues to be forged, the Caribbean has been ground zero. That is the crucible of modernity.
As an intervention that centers the Caribbean, this season of Surviving Society will provide a window into several of the region's grassroots struggles for land, life, and liberation.
On today's episode, we spoke with Pablo, who is the Program Director for the Maya Leaders Alliance and Toledo Alcaldes Association, two Maya organizations led by the traditional leaders of the 39 Maya villages in southern Belize. Pablo joined us to discuss the historic 2015 Caribbean Court of Justice judgment and consent order, which affirmed customary Maya land rights.
Welcome, Pablo. Today we're going to have a discussion about the Maya struggle of Belize. We were speaking a bit earlier about global indigenous struggles, as well as then to the degree to which indigenous people, as diverse as they are, all across the world, are asserting their political agency, are organizing, as well as fighting for things like land, freedom, dignity, autonomy, and self-determination. Before we drill down on some of the specifics about the Maya struggle in Toledo District, Southern Belize, I'm wondering if maybe you can just give us a bit of an overview about the work you do, the organizations that you're a part of, as well as then what has brought you to the type of work that you're doing. So just a bit about what you're up to with respect to the Maya struggle for land and self-determination in Belize, as well as then to what does that look like on a day-to-day basis, and how does that link also to the historical trajectory of colonialism, as well as then to what indigenous people have been facing historically.
Sail Cholech, greetings from the lands of the Maya people in southern Belize. It's a pleasure to be speaking on the important questions that you have raised. First off, I want to express my solidarity to all indigenous brothers and sisters, to the many local communities that are out there who have stood defiant in ensuring that we do our duty and our responsibility, one that we owe to the children for children, and that is to try to ensure that we are constantly seeking out, that we're actively participating in creating a world where many worlds can exist. The Maya FG and the Maya Mopan of southern Belize have for decades collectively struggled to demand for the recognition of as first people of the lands that Belize is in. This recognition, of course, is based on the aspirations that we have as a great people, an aspiration that speaks to our ability to take charge of our lives, to contribute deliberately to the forming of communities and societies where we feel that each and everyone is cared for and is able to have a good chance at making and living a dignified life. Now, what I just said is often easy to speak of in words, but very difficult to actually live and experience. And this then has come in the face of organized attempts by those who have interest over the resources of our land. And despite all that, we have been very fortunate to have a very strong system of governance, one that goes back to pre-contact, pre-colonial days. It is a system that allows us to be community and to be accountable to community, and one that has been able to allow us to join our thoughts and our voices in taking a stand for what we believe is right. In that context, I have had the honor and the privilege to be a part of this struggle through the Maya Leaders Alliance and the Toledo Alcalde Association, now through as well the True Lynching Society, is an indigenous organization that is established to primarily provide technical legal support to the cultural institutions of the Maya people, the Maya Leaders Alliance and the Toledo Alcaldes Association. Now, on a day-to-day basis, our work, of course, is many, but perhaps the singular most important priority that we have is for us as a people to be able to live free, to live without fear on our land. There was a time when our community leaders realized that the marginalization that exists will place us at a disadvantage now, given the fact that we find ourselves within recently drawn borders, in our case, now being in Belize. The need for social infrastructure, the need for access to education, to health, to the mainstream economy has always been beyond the reach of Maya communities. And the earlier organizing of leaders then was attempting to address those issues. Our leaders, though, quickly realized that as much as we dream of being a part of the economy, as much as we dream of being a part of the education system and the healthcare system, we realize that in the absence of being free on our land, we will not even have a chance to become a part of those social programs. So the efforts then shifted to ensuring that we protect our existence on our ancestral land. So the last 30 years then have focused on building and strengthening our institutions in communities on these lands, and in also using strategic litigation and the international community and benchmarks and standards now established globally to advance and to, in many ways, then force the hands of our government to comply with obligations it has accepted as a part of the global community. I offer all of that just to set out the stage that our work within the Maya communities is many, but it is one that we believe is singularly important if we are to continue existing as Maya Ekchi and Maya Mopan.
Wonderful summary of the context, as well as then too what's at stake with respect to what the Maya in Southern Belize are organizing for. You mentioned a couple of things there. I'm wondering if maybe you could elaborate upon them. One was very much so seemingly the grassroots movement building that you're doing amongst communities. Outreach, you were talking about the way in which the state seemingly has, and this is my term, I don't know how you would feel about it, in so many ways abandoned the Maya to some degree. Maybe purposely. I've heard this term, organized abandonment, neglect by design, these sorts of things, which oftentimes have links to historical colonial relations as well as institutions that were imposed upon different communities as well as geographies. You very much had mentioned too the type of borders that you're having to navigate. So in addition to the grassroots movement building, which we'll touch upon, you also mentioned the strategic litigation, as well as then to the ways in which the Maya communities are breathing life into their customary governance system, which has existed prior to colonizers setting foot on Mayan ancestral lands. And I'm wondering what that struggle for land looks like in the contemporary moment or in the present day. So we recognize, one, it's a historical struggle, as well as then two, you're engaging in grassroots movement building. But then two, I know in Belize there's been a landmark court case recognizing Indigenous, in particular the Maya land rights. So I'm wondering maybe if you could give us a bit of an overview of that land rights struggle, the victory in 2015, as well as then too, I mean, now it's 2023, almost a decade later. What has been happening since that watershed case? And what do the realities of struggling for land and freedom look like in Toledo District?
It's very important to not forget the fact that Indigenous communities have had like great civilizations. We've been a people that have innovated, that have had elaborate governments, elaborate economy, and there's no denying of that. So we must always then start our understanding of the efforts of Indigenous peoples now from that position, if it is that we're honestly committed to recognizing and respecting them. This is not a matter of trying to fit Indigenous peoples into contemporary systems and processes. There certainly needs to be marriages along some lines, but that whatever that marriage is one that has to be led by Indigenous peoples themselves. And this perhaps is the most trying aspect to the struggles as it is now. The history of land rights here speaks to that trying reality. There were earlier on some negotiations between the Maya people and the government of Belize. The fact is that no Indigenous groups, I think, wishes to be dragged through the court system, a system that we all know takes years, requires a lot of resources, particularly financial, and that is often beyond the territories of Indigenous people. So access to it in the first instance is quite difficult. So no Indigenous people wants to be dragged through the court system. In our case, though, negotiations kept failing, even when there were some agreements. Keep in mind, for instance, there was the 10 points of agreement, where there was a recognition of all rights to our land. There was a plan to begin implementing that recognition in concrete terms in the development agenda of the region, in the policy work of the government. The day that was signed, it was very ceremonial and festive, and our people were very happy. It ended there. We never saw any follow through to that agreement. And in fact, it was recently referred to by the courts as a treaty between the Maya people and the government of Belize that was never implemented in good faith. So that then pushed us to continue seeking ways to utilize regional judicial institutions to our advantage. Keep in mind now that there is a global effort of growth in terms of Indigenous peoples breaking grounds to have their rights recognized. So we did reached out to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and in 2004 they eventually released their recommendation, which perhaps is the first elaborate legal document that outlined what the rights of the Maya people are, the violation that has been happening, and the remedies that need to be put in place. Now, all this while, there is, of course, always interest in the resources of our land. And I want to keep emphasizing that it is not Indigenous peoples who are interested in anything else that's out there. It is really those that are out there who have an eye set on the resources we have on our land. And so that continued to be a problem while we tried to negotiate. And it led, for instance, to the unfortunate death of one of our renowned Maya leader, the late William Cho. His death is smeared in all these lobbying that was going on by multinational logging company. And at that time, he was the first Maya leader to consciously organize community leaders, lead peaceful protests, and brought international visibility to the plight of the Maya people. So Despite the recommendation of the Inter-American Commission, we still saw the sale of land, the issuing of concession, even now oil being then an interest in the land. And the Maya people went back to court, and fortunately, in 2007, we were able to get our first decision at the Supreme Court of Belize, which basically affirmed the recommendations that were already set out by the Inter-American Commission. And the basis or the fundamental articulation of those judgments lies in one, recognizing that Maya people have continuously and continue to occupy the lands that they use, enjoy, and still own. And secondly, that this gives rise then to their land tenure rights to those lands and resources, and that those rights are recognized, and that the property rights as defined under the Constitution of Belize, and that there is then an obligation to protect them. Thirdly, the court said that the government have failed to correct this historical wrong. So while this was continuing from the days of the British government, when it became independent, when Belize became independent, did not take any concrete steps to correct the historical wrongs against indigenous peoples. And then there's an order to obligate the government to put legislative and administrative measures in place to protect those rights. The court then went on to instruct the government to ensure that the lands that the Maya people use, enjoy, occupy is defined, that it be delimited and titled to them. And then lastly, the government of the court also imposed a cease and desist upon the government, because you cannot continue to issue logging concession, land sales, while implementation would be ongoing, because by the time we reach implementation, there would be nothing else to protect on those lands. So the court in 2007 was very clear. Now, the challenge was that it was only for 2 pilot communities. And in our humble mind, in the humble thinking of our leaders, we take a Maya community and a Mopan community. And if the court is favorable, then it should apply to everybody. Unfortunately, the government did not see it that way. And their position quickly changed to that, where if the remaining Maya communities, aside from the 2 that went to court, needed the same protection, they would each have to have their day in court. And of course, then the land grabbing, the issuing of concessions continued. And this then led to the next case, which was fortunately went up to the Supreme Court very quickly. And in 2010, we were able to get a decision for all the communities, basically reforming the 2007 decision. Now, the government appealed that. So we had to go to the Belize Court of Appeal, and then eventually to the Caribbean Court of Justice, the highest appellate court for Belize. And importantly for us, the government conceded, and a consent order was then entered between the Maya people and the government of Belize. And since 2015, we're now locked into negotiations in terms of the implementation of the court orders. Now, it's very important for the Caribbean to pay attention to the case of the Maya people, because it sets the parameters, it sets the norms, the jurisprudence for indigenous people's rights within the Caribbean. This is not just about Maya people's rights, because the Maya case is built off internationally accepted norms and standards. And many of our countries, including those in the Caribbean, have signed on to these international treaties, these international mechanisms. So a part of what we're seeing here is merely the Maya people in contemporary times learning to utilize these mechanisms, these treaties, the judicial process to bring bearing on the government, so that we as citizens participate in shaping and in growing the countries that we now find ourselves in. So that's in a summary is kind of where we are. So we're now locked into negotiations as it relates to implementations. Now maybe I'll speak a little bit about that because that's a whole nother process. So the implementation has been marred with issues of good faith, of consistency, of truly taking on this matter as an obligation on government. Often, our political leaders or policy makers feel that it is their discretion. It is that there is a room for political convenience to shape these decisions. That has been perhaps the singular stumbling block that we have experienced in the implementation negotiation. We are of the position that this is a court order, that this is based on international norms, that this is not subject to the sentiments, to the emotions of any partisan politics or any individual. That this is not about the Maya people begging for their rights. This is a matter of the national development of a country like Belize to mature in terms of ensuring that the constitutional rights of its citizens are fully and truly protected. So we've been locked in a long-drawn negotiation where processes are very hard to hold steady when a government changes in terms of, in Belize, and I think a lot of the Caribbean are the same. We have 2-3-party system political institutions. So when one comes out, the other one comes in. And when one comes in, they want to change everything that the predecessor have put in place. So we've spent, unfortunately, a whole lot of time reminding the government of Belize that processes are established to ensure that their consistency, to ensure that we're within the confines of the Constitution of Belize, that we're able to achieve the minimum standards established by international law, and that we're able to fulfill the spirit of the court order. Now, this delay, of course, has had vast implications on the Maya people. It essentially puts the lives of a whole region on a hold, because as it relates to how would government work in the region, it becomes complicated. So there needs to be some certainty, and we've tried to ensure that the government sees this. The beauty of the Maya Leonard's case, and one of the other reasons it is novel in the Caribbean, is because the Caribbean Court of Justice, I think, it's its first case that deals with the recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples within the Caribbean, within a fairly new judicial system. It perhaps made one of the most impactful decisions, and that is that they retained supervision over the implementation of their order. And their supervision, while we feel there's a lot more to desire, we do feel that it has been a very important cornerstone in bringing the parties back and directing both sides down a path that allows for continued engagement, continued discussion. Otherwise, we feel that this would have been taken over a long time ago by government, and it continues to try to do this. So I wanted to mention that novel decision of the court in terms of retaining supervision over a very complex order, one that in the legal sphere is complex, and on the ground in terms of its practical implications, it's even triple more complex. So I think its role there has been very important.
I want to ask about the state and how they view the Maya-led governance structures, as well as if you can talk a little bit more about how the governance structures function, within the Maya-led communities in Belize.
Wonderful. I think that the government, in fact, wishes there was no indigenous governance institution of the Maya people. I think it sees it as an obstacle, as a struggle, as a challenge to reach to the Maya communities. But that aside, the Maya communities have invested in strengthening and in sustaining their own system of governance. Uh, for instance, from an organizational support system to the Maya people, I want to say that over 60% of our investment goes into community organizing, goes into supporting our indigenous customary leaders. Because there is another parallel system of governance that was introduced by government that is often challenged by partisan politics, motivations, and aspirations. But the alcalde system is, in fact, much more consistent and much more stable in the exercise of its duty to the community. So I think it sees, government sees this as a threat, as a obstacle in the way. Now, I think it's important to emphasize to indigenous communities that it is going to be almost impossible to realize and to rebuild indigenous communities through a foreign or through colonial institutions or mechanisms, because colonial governance structures, colonial government systems, and its very basis of existence is contrary to indigenous system of governance. The alcalde system, for instance, while it is called alcalde, and that's perhaps one of the things that stayed as a result of the encounter with the Spaniards on our lands. It is called Comunil Calebar, Holomil Calebar, or Polilca in Mopan. So the alcalde system, it's called in our language Holomil Calebar or Polilca in Mopan. The position is not of the individual. It is not of the person. The position is of the people, is of the community. In fact, we say that the alcalde is the ears, the eyes, and the lip of the community, the mouth of the community. What does that mean? It means then that as the leader of the community, your primary responsibility is to each and every member of your community to make sure that we are overseeing, that we are creating space for everybody to be included and to feel included. When we say we're the ears, we need to make sure that we're listening to everyone. When we say they are the lip, the mouth, to make sure that we are able to carry forward the will of the communities. So the alcalde system does not make decisions for communities. They carry the will of the community. The village is the village meeting, which we call the abink. It's another story to talk about what the abink means. The abink, which in contemporary understanding would be a meeting, a village meeting, is the highest authority for decision making. Now, let me talk a little bit. Maybe I'll take the opportunity to talk a little bit about the uniqueness and the novelness of the abink. So, if the abink is the highest authority for decision making, why is that so? Well, literally translated into English, abink means to listen. Abink means to listen. So, if this meeting is traditionally referred to as the abink, it means then that it is a space where everybody have a chance to share their ideas, to offer their thoughts, to be heard. But collectively, everybody, after listening to each other, will need to generate consensus or a decision on an issue. This is why the village meeting, the Abing, is the highest authority for decision making. So it is because of that that we believe the alcalde system has been able to survive. It has survived the test of time in terms of um, being undermined. There has been many attempts to consciously um, undermine the leadership of it, but we've seen that communities and their leaders, traditional leaders, have been able to come together in their collectiveness and have been able to emerge stronger after every test that they have faced.
Terms and concepts vary depending on the context. And I wanted to ask specifically about the consent order, because I mean, as a feminist, we think about the term consent in terms of an individual, and you're thinking about the individual body. But the consent order in this context, in the conversation around land rights, is different. So can you tell us a little bit more about the consent order, in relation to the FPIC, what that means for the community?
There's been an effort amongst the international community to find ways to address the many issues faced by indigenous peoples. Now, keep in mind that the struggles of indigenous peoples are a part of the social problem of the world. It's not at all isolated to indigenous peoples. The issue of marginalization, the issue of poverty, the issue of climate change, and all of this, of course, is a problem shared by the world. So there's been an effort at the global community to kind of address the issue of how do we ensure that we work with indigenous peoples to become much more organized in how they participate, in how they become a part of the solution of of the problems that they face. And one of the concepts that has emerged from that then is the principles of free, prior, and informed consent. Now, understand this in the context of the Abink of the Maya community. That's already a practice, in fact, that existed. It is the very basis, it's the very objective of the Abink, which is that it should be free, it should be prior, it should involve everybody without any coercion, and that everybody should feel that we had an opportunity to shape the decision that we're making, and that if we are right in the decision we make, then we all benefit from the fruits of it. If we are wrong in it, then we all own where it's wrong. We go back to the drawing board and we move again on the issue. So the principles of free, prior, and informed consent then needs to be understood as a part of the global community's efforts to put in place something that responds to the actual lived realities of indigenous people. So in our case, while there is a framework, the framework is really for the outside. It's really for community and government to have something that they can work within, that they can follow as they engage with communities. But clearly for Malay communities, it is already in practice. The other aspect to consent then, to free, prior, and informed consent that needs to be understood is it applies mostly to indigenous communities. And in this instance, if you consider there being a space of the collective, then decisions that are drawn from there, that are made there, are decisions of the collective. So consent is not an individual right within a community. It is a collective right. So the implications of this, which is often where the ignorance of many particularly policymakers, development agents, faced with is that they think they can go into a community and they'll ask, okay, Pablo, we would like you to tell us whether you agree or not. We'll build your road. And I say yes. And then the other person, they go to the other person and they say yes. It flies right in the face of the very principle of consent. It has to be exercised from a collective nature, and it applies to the collective, not to an individual. So I wanted to point that out because I think that there is a lot of value in following a proper FPIC process. It will help us to be more strategic in the application of resources, but it also allows us to utilize the capacity of indigenous peoples for them to be a part of the solutions of challenges they're faced with.
Where do you see the Maya community in Belize within the Caribbean region? And in the conversation around belonging and land rights in Belize, but also Belize as an island in the region, and the involvement of the Caribbean Court of Justice within the land rights discussion. Like, do y'all feel Caribbean? Is that sense of regionalism alive within the Maya communities in Belize?
And there's a lot of ways that our historical legacy has shaped how we see ourselves now. And I think as well that there is the need for a greater level of consciousness amongst our leaders, indigenous leaders, and amongst the practitioners that lend support, that are allies to indigenous peoples in the struggles of the continuous existence of colonial institutions amongst us and the danger that that inherently brings with it. I'll say, for instance, that given the fact that we've spent quite a bit of time now talking about the novelty of the Maya land rights before the courts. And I forgot to mention earlier the big fears, the big scare that our leaders had, in fact, when we were talking about now going to the courts. One of the questions they asked, for instance, the elders was, okay, so now we're going to go to court. We've been trying to talk to our government here. They've put on paper some of their ideas, and we've agreed, and they've not come true. So now, whose laws are we going to go try and argue before now? Whose court system? Has there been a place for indigenous peoples to be a part of shaping what those laws and what that court system means? And the answers of our leaders to those elders at that point is no. I mean, this is British common laws. This is the Caribbean Court of Justice. So there were real fears in going before the court system to have them now make a pronouncement on our future, given the legacy of colonial institutions not being on the side of indigenous peoples. So that's important, I think, to keep in mind, because that should give an idea then that our engagement with the law is one that has always been a conscious a strategy, one that assesses the limits of how we push issues because of the impacts that it has on our lived reality. One of the biggest challenges we have right now, for instance, is the development of domestic legislation to protect our rights. Now, keep in mind that Maya communities and indigenous peoples in general often do not have written and codified systems of knowing. And now here we are having to do that. What are the implications that that will have on our people and their future? And what is the implication that now turning over to a certain degree, the authority to be able to make laws, because indigenous peoples don't make laws. Government ministers, the cabinet, the House of Representatives, they are the ones who debate and decide how they will shape the final law. So, what are the implications of those? That has been very clear in our mind. I think it goes to the point that I am making, that when we speak of issues, for instance, as education, when we speak, for instance, of issues like the law, when we speak of issues like citizenship, we are very conscious of the colonial legacy that carries forward those institutions. And we must do so to ensure that we are constantly influencing how we may be defining um, what we mean by the terms we use. So, for instance, when we are in the process now of writing legislation, we demand that we be consulted. We demand that there is a greater level of participation in the process. And it is something that we will stand for as a people. And of course, we also then, it also means then that we take that responsibility seriously. So when we are consulting on the law, we have a system in place that goes through our leaders, goes back to communities, makes it way back. It means a lot of work, a lot of capacity, a lot of resources is needed. And this, I think, again, is another challenge that many local communities, many indigenous communities will have, because a lot of us don't have that kind of an infrastructure put in place to support our participation. So I mention all of this in the context then of the Caribbean landscape. There is a lot of learning, I think, that we can offer to the Caribbean region in terms of indigenous peoples and tribal peoples in the Caribbean. And there's also a lot that we can learn from them. There's the need for this kind of a stronger solidarity, a stronger alliance in the Caribbean. We do a lot of lobbying within the UN, and often in those lobbying rooms, we will be fortunate to see, if any at all, one or two more Caribbean indigenous representatives. And this is part of the reason why we in Belize have been trying to organize nationally, so that we can also then help to shape the formulation and the growth of a Caribbean alliance of indigenous peoples. When our governments are out there lobbying, the recent example being climate change in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, they were acting together as Caribbean governments of the Caribbean. There is a pact of government lobbies that are out there. There are certain mechanisms now that we as indigenous peoples need to start to utilize. And the more we're able to organize ourselves, the more then we can help to share our experiences and to learn from each other, and to also demand of allies of indigenous peoples to do more in investing directly in our communities and in our leadership, in our institutions, if indeed we're serious at combating the issues of inequality, of poverty, of marginalization. So I believe that there is a ripe opportunity for the Caribbean. I say this because recently there was also another decision in Guyana that made reference to the Belize case. There is a decision in Honduras that was taken up by the Garifuna communities there. And I think the moment is right for us to be able to bring together those three triangular points of Guyana, Belize, and Honduras, and to really rewrite the history of how we're able to organize, how we're able to help shape the Caribbean region by being a part of the process in our own countries.
Thank you for that, Pablo. You're very much seemingly to me touching upon the crux of modernity with respect to the way in which colonial institutions colonial respectability politics, as well as even power, have been imposed upon communities in brutal fashion, in violent fashion, as well as then, too, the ways in which the lasting legacies and enduring aftermaths of colonialism continue to resonate in the present day. You had mentioned another global challenge there that I want to talk about before we get to climate change, as well as relationships with land. You were also talking about participatory grassroots democracy, as well as then to governing from below, these sorts of things with the alcalde system, as well as then to the way in which development, national development priorities and agendas oftentimes then mean, with respect to land and the environment, that there is a lot of interest in Maya ancestral lands and territories with respect to raw materials, natural resources, extraction, encroachments into Maya communities, these sorts of things. And I know in particular, the FPIC protocol has been quite contentious. If you look up news stories, as well as do any research on the case of Belize, as well as this watershed CCJ victory in 2015, there's no shortage of instances in which there's been flashpoint issues emerging. And so I'm wondering about this notion that I've heard, which seems very problematic, as well as needs to be contested, that the Maya are balkanizing Belize, or that the Maya are trying to create a state within a state. I'm wondering, from your vantage point, what is your perspective on those types of discourses, as well as then, two, what are the primary sources of those, and then, two, what are the repercussions and some of the consequences of those types of discourses?
You know, it's interesting that we talk about direct democracy. We talk about the need to expand that policy across the world. It's often a romantic concept spoken of very loosely. But I have to say that I think the experience of the Maya people and many other indigenous peoples goes to show that democracy often is seen not from the eyes of people, but often from the eyes of the few who are interested in consolidating power, who are interested in ensuring that that power is used to determine the trajectory of the economy, and then that the economy then becomes much more important. So resources on the land and even human labor then becomes merely a necessity to keep the economy going, sustaining those in power. I say this because the practice of indigenous, of Maya communities, is indeed a form of the direct democracy on the land, and it unsettles many people, particularly politicians. And one has to ask them, why is it very unsettling for politicians? Because they often are the ones who end up being in government. Well, our assessment is that it is unsettling because this is direct democracy in action. When a government official is no longer able to simply walk into your community and tell you how to live, and tell you they will take away that piece of land and give it to their friends. Or when a multinational company can no longer simply walk into your community and wave a piece of paper in your face telling you, I have permission from the government. It is unsettling because it means that the local people have awakened, and that the law is becoming progressive in recognizing that they have a role to hold responsible how this country grows. So it is no surprise then that you begin to hear from policymakers, particularly from politicians, from government officials, the uttering of terms such as balkanization in the sense, or in the case of the Maya land rights. Now, I would implore upon everybody to do a quick search of what balkanization means and know the history and the origins of that term, the atrocities that accompanies that in terms of the global history of colonial uh, um, uh, atrocities on civilization. And the Maya people are very far away from that concept. In fact, it is the contrary that we aspire for. We are interested in seeing that our governments are held accountable for the cultural genocide they have caused upon our people. So the utterance of such terminologies can only be seen as attempts to incite hate, to incite violence directly against, in our case, Maya leaders and Maya people. And in Latin America and the Caribbean, unfortunately, last year, we had the highest incidence of killings of indigenous people. As we speak, there's an indigenous brother that is all over the news right now that many of us perhaps know has been killed just because of his role in trying to carry out his duties, his obligations for his people. And that is to see that we continue to try to build a world where we can all live. So in Belize, even the UN mechanism, treaty body, the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, in a recent report to Belize, asked that the government desist from using those terms of balkanization, of forming a state within a state in the context of the Maya land rights, because it does not fit, it is not relevant, and that it can only be seen as a form of direct discrimination against Maya people. So even the global community have recognized that the uttering of those words, which was first done by a senior politician, does not mean well. It is intended to cause harm. It is intended to undermine. It is intended to drive a wedge between the Maya people, the Maya leaders, and the general citizenry of Belize.
Thanks for that explanation, Pablo. It seems like there's a high degree of hypocritical irony that emerges whenever a state accuses indigenous people of trying to divide and rule, given the historical as well as contemporary machinations of state power, as well as the ways in which governments behave. As well as in two, you're very much talking about the everyday, concrete, very visceral and bodily experiences and tolls that land defense takes with respect to indigenous people, as well as even Afro-descendant land defenders putting their lives on the line to take to the front lines, to defend the environment, to protect community, to protect territory, these sorts of things, as well as into the sobering reality that the region that you're operating in is one of the most dangerous for land defenders in the world. Something I suspect that is not lost on anyone from the communities, as well as into folks who are organizing alongside you. One thing that I've heard you discuss, I've heard it in the communities, I've heard other Maya land defenders, Maya activists say, to pivot to a bit of on a positive note, is that the work that you're engaged in are very much oriented towards protecting territory, community, and relations. I've also heard different Maya activists, different Maya organizers talk about the ways in which you're foregrounding the joys, pains, and dreams of the Maya people. You very much have addressed some of the pains, some of the threats that you're facing with respect to state power, the driving forces of capital accumulation, development being a dangerous term, as well as the ways in which that leads to dispossession, land grabs, extraction, these sorts of things. I'm wondering if we could, if maybe you could focus a bit on some of the joys and dreams, as well as relations that you oftentimes talk about, that exist amongst Maya communities. So in terms of the very diverse pluralistic expressions of relationship with environment, of relationships with forest, as well as land and territory that exist in Southern Belize and Toledo District amongst the communities, what do those look like? How do you talk about them? What is the manifestation of relationships with land amongst the Maya communities? What does that look like?
Well, globally, I think there is now scientific evidence and scientific research that has shown that lands that is occupied and governed, lands where the rights of indigenous peoples is recognized and protected, those are often healthy lands. And by healthy lands, we mean communities that are able to provide for their basic needs, that are able to care for their basic needs. It means then that there are healthier watersheds, waterways, healthier forests. There's evidence, there's scientific evidence now that supports that reality. So this is actually the same story for southern Belize. If you fly over Belize, for instance, you'll see that much of the forest, the remaining forest, you will see is within Maya communities. And this is something that is very important to us. In fact, we say healthy lands, healthy forests, healthy people, healthy communities. That's often something that we always speak of. And my daughter, for instance, always speaks of as well now of this concept of Ralchoch. We always say we are Ralchoch, which means literally we are the children of Mother Earth. And so one would think that the aim for land tenure security is not necessarily simply a matter of having access to land and grabbing land. It means as well that we are aspiring to protect our very provider, our mother, because without it, we can't survive. And without it being healthy, we still won't be able to survive as healthy people. So this is something I think that is a story that's shared by many indigenous peoples. And now in the phase, for instance, of climate change, we hear of governments, for instance, negotiating for carbon payments, carbon offsets. The position of indigenous peoples, just like the Maya people, is that we do have a role to play in shaping what those policies are going to be, what those arrangements are going to be, because we are the ones that are among these forests. In the global box, for instance, an indigenous brother of mine from Guyana once said, well, the issue is that governments, they don't own any forest. And he was saying that in the context of being very frustrated that indigenous people's participation in the climate negotiations is often in the margins, and governments taking the front seat, but in real terms, on the ground, it is the relationship that indigenous peoples have with their land, with their forests, that has continued to sustain the remaining standing forest, the remaining biodiversity, the lifeline of this world.
That's very well put, Pablo, especially too in the contemporary crises that we're facing, in particular climate change. I mean, moving beyond recognition and sort of saying, what is the degree to which indigenous people are meaningfully shaping climate action policies, environmental justice agendas, these sorts of things. There's been gains in recognition, but like you were sort of saying, even though they might be allowed in the room, what is the degree to which they're actually being listened to? What is the degree to which they're actually being taken seriously with respect to the grounded, rooted knowledges that they have of what it takes to preserve and conserve and protect environments.
Well, on that point, I wanted to offer, for instance, that again, just as we talk about democracy being the aspirations of all countries, and it's the beacon of a developed country. Um, we talk about carbon offset, climate mitigation, for instance, and there is a lot of talk about, yes, indigenous peoples are guardians of forests, but in the negotiation, there is a failure to, for instance, truly include traditional knowledge as a source of information that should be shaping climate actions, climate decisions. So, as indigenous peoples, I think we have to be aware of these gaps that exist, of these, uh, 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 as some of our leaders would say, double tongues. You say one thing here and you say another thing in another room. Um, we have to be mindful of that, and the aim should always be to try to continue growing our alliances or solidarity, and collectively trying to hold governments at the global level in being um, uh, more precise in the inclusion of forest guidance, of forest protectors in the whole conversation related to climate change.
I don't know if there's anything I can really follow up with, Pablo. I think you've hit the nail on the head with respect to breathing life into sustainable and just futures. Summed it up perfectly there. And in particular, ending on, I mean, we can sort of wrap up on this note of solidarity. What does building solidarity and engaging in collective action look like when it goes beyond states and governments paying lip service to things, but then too, there's also grounded communities engaging in collective action who are actually breathing life into viable alternatives, as well as then too, like you had mentioned throughout the conversation, engaged in many ways in holding powerful actors accountable, as well as then too resisting and defending other ways of being that depart from the limited, if not violent, ways of being that colonialism mandated for the world. Pablo, I want to thank you for your time. This was an incredibly enlightening conversation, uplifting even amidst all of the different challenges you were talking about. So wishing you nothing but the best, sending solidarity, as well as then too, we'll be keeping our eyes on what's going on in Belize, in particular with respect to the degree to which the state engages in good faith behavior, as well as then too pays heed to what the Maya communities are doing.
Well, thank you very much. And maybe just my parting word is that as indigenous peoples, it's important that our starting point goes back to the truth. And that is that as a people, we have always had our own system of organizing. We've innovated. We've had our system of economy, our system of governance. It is our duty then that in the modern times we find ourselves, we take our power, we take our place where we belong. And we've seen the failures of contemporary concepts that have attempted to, or that have been preached to be the solution of our problems. We've known that they have made our problems even worse in many instances. So it's time that we believe in ourselves, we believe in our capacity, we take our place. And solidarity amongst us is very important. We need to make sure we expand the reach of our voice. We need to make sure that we're able to identify the allies that stand with us, and to bring our allies to see our pains, our joys, and that they truly become the force that are under us as we propel ourselves to occupy the spaces where we need to be. There is no way that this world can solve its problems without Indigenous peoples. We are a part of the solution. And I see our brothers and sisters putting their lives on the line to ensure that we are able to continue as a people and that we're able to contribute to sustaining the humanity of this world. So thank you again for also offering me to share these few thoughts and ideas to the great struggle of our people here, the Maya people.
Our pleasure, Pablo. And I'm sure listeners will be moved to action as well as inspired by not only the episode, but in particular by those very uplifting as well as inspirational words that you just shared. So thanks for your time.
Thank you for listening to Surviving Society.
To support our work, you can rate,
review and subscribe. To host or produce a series of Surviving Society,
get in touch with us via Twitter or Instagram.